The steel door groaned under the force of the wind, the sound of a dying animal. Outside, the world was a screaming vortex of blackness and splintered wood. But it wasn't the storm that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was the frantic, terrified pounding on the door. "Miller! For God's sake, Miller! Let us in!" A voice shrieked, barely audible over the roar. It was Preston Whitmore, the same man who, just last week, had stood right here with his friends, laughing and calling my shelter a $20 tomb for a crazy old man. Now, he was begging to be let into my junk bunker because the tornado had just turned his $1 million mansion into toothpicks. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the ending of this story, and comment below. What city are you listening from today? It all started with a piece of paper and a lie. I'm Arthur Miller, and for 40 years, my hands knew only the grain of wood. I was a master carpenter, you see. I could make a dovetail joint so perfect it looked like two pieces of wood had grown together from the same tree. But when my wife passed, and the silence in our big house became a roar louder than any saw, I sold it all. I wanted something small, something quiet, something mine. That's when I met Preston Whitmore. He was a developer in the town of Wolf Creek, with a smile as wide and as shallow as a puddle on a hot sidewalk. He wore suits that cost more than my first car, and had a handshake that felt like a promise he'd already broken. He heard I was looking for a small plot of land, just an acre or two to put a little cabin on. He showed me a spot on the edge of town, overgrown with weeds and littered with the ghosts of old farm equipment. He called it rustic charm. He said for a man of my skills, it was a blank canvas. He sold it to me for a song, or so I thought. The deed was signed, my life savings were exchanged, and he even threw in an old buried culvert pipe on the property for free, calling it a potential root cellar. He laughed when he said it. I should have paid more attention to that laugh. When I finally got a surveyor out to the property a week later, I learned the truth. The land was unstable, a high-risk flood zone, completely unsuitable for any kind of traditional construction. The foundation for even a small cabin would sink into the mud within a year. Whitmore knew. He'd unloaded a worthless plot on a grieving old man. When I confronted him, he just shrugged, that same oily smile plastered on his face. "Caveat emptor, Mr. Miller," he said, which is Latin for "the buyer is the fool." He pointed to the rusted, corrugated steel pipe half buried in the hillside. "You still have your root cellar. Maybe you can live in that." His laughter followed me all the way back to my truck. I sat there, the useless deed in my trembling hands, and looked at that piece of junk. It was 10 feet in diameter, maybe 30 feet long, and filled with dirt and rust. It was an eyesore. It was garbage. But as I stared at it, the gears in my old carpenter's mind began to turn. A lifetime of building things that stood strong against the odds began to whisper ideas. He thought he'd sold me a tomb. I decided I would build a fortress. The vision came to me not in a flash of lightning, but in a slow, steady burn, like the embers of a hardwood fire. I stood there, mud squelching under my worn boots, and looked at that corrugated steel tube, not as a piece of trash, but as a spine. It was the bone structure of something new. Preston Whitmore and the town of Wolf Creek saw a worthless, flood-prone patch of dirt. I saw a sanctuary. The problem with building above ground was the instability of the soil, the constant threat of shifting earth and rising water. But what if I didn't build up? What if I built down? What if I used the earth itself as my shield? The culvert was already there, a forgotten artery in the hillside. My plan was simple in concept, but monumental in execution. I would not remove the pipe. I would unearth it, seal it, and turn it into the core of a subterranean dwelling, a bunker that would be immune to the tornadoes that raked across our part of the country every spring. It would be my shelter, my workshop, and my home. I spent the next week not with a shovel, but with a pencil and a stack of drafting paper. My old hands, stiff with age, found their rhythm again. I designed a space that flowed within the confines of the tube. A small living area, a compact workshop, a tiny but functional kitchen. I engineered a ventilation system, a plumbing system that would work with gravity, and a plan for a sealed, watertight entrance. The sheer audacity of it made me smile. I was going to build a home out of the very symbol of my humiliation. The cost was the biggest hurdle. Whitmore had taken almost everything. I had less than $1,000 to my name, so conventional materials were out of the question. This home would not be built from the catalogue of a hardware store. It would be built from the scraps and refuse of a society that threw things away. My new lumberyard would be the county dump. My new hardware store, the local scrapyard. Every bolt, every plank, every fixture would have a story. It would be a mosaic of the forgotten. I drew up a list. I needed steel plates to seal the ends, marine-grade sealant, lumber for the interior framing, pipes for air and water, and 1,000 other small things. The final line item on my budget list read, "Initial purchase of core structure, $20. That's what I'd paid for the land after all. Everything else was just dressing. I pinned the finished blueprint to the dashboard of my rusty pickup truck. It was a cross-section of a dream, a diagram of defiance. Anyone else would have seen a madman's scribbles. I saw the path to my own survival, my own quiet rebellion. The laughter of Preston Whitmore still echoed in my ears, but now it sounded different. It wasn't an insult anymore. It was fuel. The next morning, I became a scavenger. The Wolf Creek County dump became my cathedral, a sprawling testament to waste and opportunity. I was there when the gates opened, my breath fogging in the chilly dawn air. The smell was a thick, sweet rot, a perfume of decay. But to me, it smelled like possibility. I had my list, my tools, and a determination that felt as solid as steel. My first priority was sealing the culvert. I needed metal, thick and unforgiving. I spent days sifting through piles of industrial scrap, my hands raw from pulling at twisted rebar and rusted panels. Then I found it, the discarded shell of an old fuel tanker. It was thick, curved steel, perfect for fabricating end caps for my cylindrical home. The scrapyard owner, a grizzled man named Gus, watched me with a curious eye. "What's an old-timer like you building?" he asked, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near my boot. "A tomb," I said with a straight face. He just grunted and charged me $10 for a pile of steel that was worth 100 times that in scrap value alone. He must have figured he was helping a crazy man fulfill his last wish. Next was lumber. I haunted construction sites, asking for cast-offs and broken pallets. I became a familiar sight, my old truck piled high with warped boards and splintered 2x4s. To them, it was firewood. To me, it was the framework of my future walls, the bones of my bed, the surface of my workbench. Each piece of wood had its own character, its own history of nail holes and saw marks. I learned to read their stories and give them a new one. Plumbing was a puzzle of mismatched pipes and discarded fixtures. I found a cracked porcelain sink behind a demolished diner, a toilet with a broken tank from a motel renovation, and yards of copper piping that had been ripped out of an old schoolhouse. I carefully straightened the bent sections, patched the cracks in the sink with epoxy, and pieced together a system that would rely on a simple cistern and the unyielding law of gravity. Every evening, I would return to my land, my truck loaded with the day's treasures. I worked under the dim glow of a single, battery-powered lantern, sorting, cleaning, and preparing my materials. The pile of salvaged goods grew steadily beside the half-buried culvert. It was a strange collection. Bent nails I'd hammered straight, old windows from a torn-down greenhouse, a discarded marine bilge pump that I figured I could use for drainage. The people of Wolf Creek started to notice. They'd drive by slowly, their faces a mixture of pity and amusement. They saw a crazy old man surrounded by a mountain of trash. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't see the watertight seals, the insulated walls, the clever shelving that would fit the curve of the steel. They saw the junk. I saw the bunker. The real work began with the earth itself. I had to excavate the rest of the 30-foot culvert, to free it from the mud and clay that had held it captive for decades. I didn't have an excavator, just a shovel and a wheelbarrow. It was back-breaking, soul-testing labor. Every morning, my muscles screamed in protest. Every evening, I'd fall onto my cot in the back of my truck, too tired to even dream. But with every shovelful of dirt, the culvert revealed more of itself. It was like unearthing a sleeping metal giant. Once it was fully exposed, I saw the full extent of the rust and decay. There were holes, some as small as a pinprick, others as large as my fist. Preston Whitmore hadn't just sold me a useless pipe, he'd sold me a metal sieve. For a week, I did nothing but clean and prepare the steel. I used a wire brush on an angle grinder, the screech of metal on metal echoing across the empty field. Sparks flew around me like angry fireflies as I stripped away the rust, taking the surface down to the bare, wounded steel. Then came the sealing. I used a thick, black, marine-grade tar, slathering it over every inch of the exterior. It was sticky, messy work. I was covered in it, my skin stained black, but I knew that this ugly coat was the only thing that would stand between me and the suffocating pressure of wet earth. After the tar, I wrapped the entire structure in thick sheets of plastic I'd salvaged from a farmer's old silo covers, using a blowtorch to melt the seams together, creating a waterproof cocoon. The foundation was next. I couldn't pour a single massive slab, so I did it in sections. I mixed concrete by hand in a wheelbarrow, 180-pound bag at a time. I poured a thick base inside the culvert, embedding rebar I'd scavenged to give it strength. This concrete floor did more than just provide a level surface. It acted as a ballast, anchoring the culvert to the ground, ensuring it wouldn't shift or, heaven forbid, try to float in a flood. Then came the most crucial part, the end caps. I spent 2 weeks cutting the thick steel from the old fuel tanker with a grinder, shaping it into 2 massive circles. Hoisting them into place was a challenge that almost defeated me. I used a system of levers, pulleys, and the sheer stubborn will of an old man. I welded them into place, my mask hiding the grimace of exertion on my face. The final seal was a heavy, watertight marine door I'd found at a ship salvage yard 3 towns over. It cost me $200, my single biggest expense, but it was worth every penny. When I closed that door for the first time, the solid, satisfying thud echoed in the metal tube. The outside world went silent. It was in that moment, surrounded by the smell of curing concrete and fresh welds, that I knew. This wasn't a tomb. It was a vault. I had taken a piece of junk, a symbol of my shame, and I had made it strong. I had built the foundation, not just of a shelter, but of my new life. Word of the crazy old carpenter and his hobbit hole had spread through Wolf Creek like a summer cold. My strange project became a form of local entertainment. People would drive by on a Sunday afternoon, pointing and laughing. But it was Preston Whitmore who took the mockery to a new level. He started bringing his friends, wealthy investors, and smirking town council members on tours of my property line. He'd stand there, just beyond my fence, and narrate my work as if I were a zoo animal. "And here, gentlemen," he'd say in a booming voice, "you see the remnants of a man's dignity. He's building a home out of garbage." His friends would chuckle, their expensive leather shoes getting muddy as they strained for a better look. One Saturday, he brought a small crowd. They had coolers and lawn chairs. They were tailgating my failure. Whitmore, emboldened by his audience, walked right up to my fence line. I was in the middle of framing the interior walls with the reclaimed lumber, the gentle curve of the steel presenting a unique carpentry challenge. "Miller," he shouted, his voice dripping with condescension. "I have to admit, I'm impressed. It takes a special kind of crazy to build a house that a good rain will turn into a coffin. Tell me, do you have gills?" His friends roared with laughter. I didn't answer. I just kept my head down, my saw moving in a steady, straight line. My silence only seemed to encourage him. He pulled out his phone and started filming. "We're live here at the $20 junk bunker," he narrated, panning his phone across my pile of salvage materials. and then to me. The future of low-cost housing, folks, for those who don't mind drowning in their sleep. The video went locally viral. People I'd known for years would see me in the grocery store and shake their heads, whispering. The kids in town started calling my place the trash can house. The mockery was a constant, buzzing noise in the background of my life. It was a heavy weight, and there were days when it felt like it might crush me. There were nights when I'd sit on my cot, the cold steel of the bunker walls seeming to press in on me, and I'd wonder if they were right. Was I just a fool, playing with scraps while the world laughed? But then, I'd run my hand over a perfectly joined piece of wood, or check the seal on my watertight door, and the doubt would recede. Laughter was just air. A well-built wall was real. Let them laugh, I told myself. A storm is coming. Not the kind you see on the news, but a quiet, personal one. And I would be ready. They were building their houses on sand and arrogance. I was building mine on a foundation of solid steel and stubborn pride. If you believe that true strength is built from the things the world throws away, take a moment to like this video and show your support. The greatest challenge wasn't the ridicule or the back-breaking labor. It was making the inside of a steel tube livable. Two problems reigned supreme: air and light. A sealed metal box buried underground is a death trap without a reliable source of fresh air. I spent weeks designing a ventilation system that was both effective and subtle. I couldn't have a large, obvious vent pipe sticking out of the ground. That would just be another target for vandals or thieves. The solution came from the memory of a submarine documentary I'd watched years ago. Periscopes. I could use the same principle for air. I salvaged long sections of 6-inch PVC pipe from a construction dumpster. I created a dual pipe system. One pipe would serve as the intake, the other as the exhaust. The true genius of the design was in the camouflage. The intake pipe terminated about 50 yards away from the bunker, hidden inside a hollowed-out log I placed near a thicket of trees. It was covered with a fine mesh to keep out critters and debris. The exhaust pipe ran up the trunk of a tall pine tree on the other side of the property, painted to match the bark, its opening hidden amongst the high branches. To keep the air moving, I installed a small 12-volt fan, the kind used to cool computers, into the exhaust duct. And to power it, I had my greatest find from the scrapyard, a slightly cracked but still functional solar panel. I mounted it flat on a piece of high ground, concealed by a patch of wildflowers. It didn't generate much power, but it was enough to run the fan and charge a small battery bank for a couple of LED lights. It was my breakthrough. The first time I switched on the fan, I felt a gentle, cool draft whisper through the bunker. It was the breath of life. It was the moment the bunker stopped being a steel tube and started being a home. For light, I installed the old greenhouse windows at a steep angle above the main entrance, creating a small subterranean sunroom just before the steel door. It was protected by a heavy steel grate I'd welded together from old rebar. It didn't let in a lot of light, but it was enough to read by during the day and to keep the space from feeling like a complete tomb. The final piece of the puzzle was water. I engineered a rainwater collection system on a small shed I built nearby to store my tools. The runoff was channeled through a series of filters, sand, charcoal and gravel, into a holding tank buried next to the bunker. From there, it was a simple gravity-fed system to the sink. It was all coming together. My strange collection of junk was becoming a symphony of survival. The bunker was more than just a shelter. It was a living, breathing system, powered by the sun, hydrated by the rain, and breathing through hidden lungs. While the town laughed at the old man in his trash pile, I was quietly building the most secure and self-sufficient home in all of Wolf Creek. They couldn't see it, and that was the whole point. The true strength was hidden, buried deep in the earth. Spring arrived in Wolf Creek with a violent, schizophrenic temper. One day would be warm and sunny. The next, the sky would turn a bruised, greenish purple. We all knew the signs. This was tornado season. The air would get thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and electricity. The birds would go silent. It was a silence that was more terrifying than any noise. I was putting the finishing touches on my interior, installing shelves that curved with the walls, when the first sirens went off. It was a test, as it was on the first Tuesday of every month, but this time it felt different. The sky to the west was the color of an old bruise. I checked the small, battery-powered weather radio I kept on my workbench. The tinny voice of the announcer was calm, but the words were chilling. A significant tornadic thunderstorm was developing. It was still miles away, but it was moving fast, and it was heading our way. I secured everything outside, tying down the tarp on my woodpile and locking my tools in the shed. I felt a strange sense of calm. I had been preparing for this day for months. Every weld, every seal, every shovelful of dirt had been leading to this moment. The town of Wolf Creek, however, seemed oblivious. Kids were still playing in their yards, and I could hear the distant buzz of a lawnmower. People here had become complacent. The sirens were just background noise. An hour later, the sky turned from bruise to black. The wind began to whip the trees into a frenzy. The weather radio crackled again, the announcer's voice no longer calm. "This is a tornado emergency for Wolf Creek," he said, his voice strained. "A large, extremely dangerous tornado is on the ground. This is a particularly dangerous situation. Seek shelter immediately." The tone in his voice said what the words couldn't. This wasn't a drill. This was the real thing. I retreated into my bunker, the heavy steel door closing with a reassuring thud. I sealed the locks and looked around my small circular home. The LED lights cast a soft, steady glow. The ventilation fan hummed quietly. It was calm. It was safe. Outside, the world was beginning to scream. The wind rose from a roar to a shriek, the sound of 1,000 freight trains all at once. The ground began to vibrate. But in my little bunker, built from junk and ridicule, I was ready. I sat on my cot, my hands resting on my knees, and I waited for the storm to hit. The sound is something you feel more than you hear. It started as a low rumble that vibrated up through the concrete floor, a deep-throated growl from the earth itself. Then the pressure in my ears dropped, a painful popping sensation, and the gentle hum of my ventilation fan became a high-pitched whine as the air was sucked violently outwards. That's when the roar began. It wasn't like a train. It was like being inside the engine of the train, a deafening, all-consuming chaos of sound that seemed to shred the very air. The ground shook. Small jars of nuts and bolts rattled on my shelves, a tiny metallic clatter against the symphony of destruction outside. I could feel the immense power of the storm passing directly over me, a multi-ton beast rolling across the roof of my world. There was a sudden, violent thud against the hillside above, then a long, scraping sound, like giant claws dragging across my buried home. I imagined the massive pine trees I had cherished being ripped out of the ground by their roots. For a terrifying minute, the LED lights flickered and died, plunging me into absolute, suffocating darkness. The silence of the electronics was more frightening than the noise of the storm. In that moment, I was just a man in a buried metal tube, and I wondered if Preston Whitmore had been right after all. Was this my $20 tomb? I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then, with a crackle, the lights came back on, powered by the battery bank. I had never been so happy to see the soft glow of an LED bulb. The worst of the roar lasted for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. It gradually receded, replaced by the sound of heavy rain and the eerie, intermittent crash of things settling in the ruins above. The immediate, violent threat was over. I was alive. My bunker, my ridiculous home of junk and scraps, had held. It had taken the full force of a monster tornado and it hadn't budged. I stood up on shaky legs and walked to my periscope, a simple device I'd made from PVC pipe and 2 angled mirrors. I pulled the cover off the eyepiece and looked. The image was blurry, spinning, and upside down. The top of the periscope, hidden in the pine tree, had been snapped off. It didn't matter. The proof wasn't in what I could see. It was in what I could feel. The solid floor beneath my feet, the dry air in my lungs, and the steady, unbroken walls around me. I had built my house upon the rock, or rather, in it. An hour passed in near silence, broken only by the sound of rain drumming on the earth above. The silence was unnerving. It was the sound of a world erased. Finally, I decided it was time. I took a deep breath, grabbed a heavy flashlight, and unsealed the locks on the massive steel door. It swung inward smoothly, without any resistance from debris. The small protected entryway I had built was intact, but the light that filtered down was wrong. It was too bright, too open. I climbed the few steps to the surface and pushed open the heavy steel grate that protected the entrance. The world I had known was gone. Devastation stretched in every direction. The lush green landscape of Wolf Creek was a mangled brown wasteland of splintered trees and unrecognizable debris. The sky was still a grim slate grey, but there were no buildings to block the view. Not anymore. My small tool shed was gone, vanished without a trace. The tall pine trees were snapped in half, their majestic tops ripped away. But the ground around my bunker entrance was scoured clean, the force of the wind having swept away any loose dirt or debris, leaving only the hardened earth and the steel of my home. I walked out into the surreal landscape, my boots crunching on a carpet of shattered glass and shredded insulation. And then I saw it, or rather, what was left of it. On the hill overlooking my property, where Preston Whitmore's magnificent 3-story mansion had stood, there was nothing. Just a foundation, a flat, empty slab of concrete, wiped clean as if by a giant's hand. It was as if the house had never existed. As I stood there trying to process the sheer, unimaginable scale of the destruction, I saw movement near the road. A small group of figures, dazed and stumbling. They were caked in mud, their clothes torn. As they got closer, I recognized them. It was Preston Whitmore, his wife, and their 2 teenage children. His expensive suit was shredded. His face was pale with shock, a small cut bleeding on his forehead. His wife was sobbing quietly, clutching a single mud-stained family photo. They looked like ghosts, haunted figures in the wreckage of their own lives. They saw me standing there, a lone figure in the wasteland, next to the unassuming steel grate that was the entrance to my home. They stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. They started walking towards me, their pace quickening. It was then that the pounding started. Not the pounding of the storm, but the frantic, desperate pounding of a human hand on my steel door. "Miller! For God's sake, Miller, let us in!" Whitmore's voice was hoarse, a raw shriek of terror and desperation. The man who had everything, who had mocked and ridiculed me, was now at my door, begging. He wasn't laughing anymore. I stood at the top of the steps, looking down at Preston Whitmore. His face, usually a mask of smug superiority, was now stripped bare, showing only raw, primal fear. The rain was starting again, a cold, miserable drizzle. His family huddled behind him, shivering. "Please, Miller," he begged, his voice cracking. "Everything is gone. The storm. It took everything. We have nowhere to go." His wife looked at me, her eyes pleading. She was no longer the woman who had smirked from the passenger seat of her husband's luxury car. She was just a mother, terrified for her children. I looked past them, at the apocalyptic landscape that was once our town. I thought about the months of backbreaking work, the ridicule, the condescending laughter. I thought about the $10 check I wrote him for this worthless piece of land. I had every reason to close the door, to leave them to the mercy of the elements they had so arrogantly ignored. I could have savoured the irony, the perfect, karmic justice of it all. For a moment, a hard, cold part of me wanted to. I wanted to tell him, "Caveat emptor, Mr. Whitmore." But then I looked at his children, their faces streaked with mud and tears. They weren't responsible for their father's arrogance. They were just cold, scared kids. And I looked at my home, this tiny, circular fortress of steel and concrete, built from the things their world had thrown away. It was more than just a shelter. It was a testament to the idea that true security doesn't come from money or status. It comes from foresight, hard work, and humility. It comes from respecting the power of nature and preparing for the worst. My bunker wasn't built for revenge. It was built for survival. And survival, I realized in that moment, wasn't just about protecting yourself. It was about having something left to offer when everything else was gone. I stepped aside. "Get in," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "All of you. There's not much room, but it's dry and it's safe." The relief that washed over their faces was a sight I will never forget. They scrambled down the steps into the warm, dimly lit space, their eyes wide with wonder at the tidy, organized interior. Preston was the last one to enter. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at me, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of gratitude, shame, and awe. "Why?" he whispered. I looked him square in the eye. "Because a home is more than just a house, Preston," I said. "And a man is more than just his pride." As I sealed the heavy steel door behind them, shutting out the wind and the rain, I knew one thing for certain. They had laughed at my $20 junk bunker, but in the end, it was the only thing left standing. It had become the last castle in a kingdom of ruins. What do you think is the most important quality for survival? Is it strength, intelligence, or humility? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that will make you think.